Now that you've learned a little bit about what it means to go affirmative in a debate, I'd like to talk for just a second about one of the most important, if not the most important parts of being affirmative, and that is having a plan. Your plan is the words that you choose that you will defend as being the alternative to the current system. These are the things that you will say should be done or ought to be done, because what is currently happening is not sufficient in order to be able to fix the problems. So in this video, we're going to cover the basic ideas of what needs to be in a plan text and how you can avoid some of the problems that might show up if other people have questions about your plan text. The first thing that needs to be in a plan text is the agent. Most of the time, this is going to be defined for you by the topic. So, for example, if the topic says the United States federal government should substantially increase funding for schools, you know that at the very minimum, the agent of your plan is going to be the United States federal government. Now, there are some ways that you can get around this and that you can pick a slightly different agency as long as it is one that is within the federal government. But I would definitely suggest that that reasoning is laid out in a piece of evidence. So, for example, you might have your agency say the Department of Education will for your plan text, or you might say Congress will, or the President of the United States will, or the United States Supreme Court will. You can have agencies oftentimes within the United States federal government pass your plan, but for the most part, you definitely want to focus in on what it would look like to have the federal government do it generally. Most literature is also written that way because realistically, most literature is not going to say that like the president should sign an executive order on this piece of legislation or on this idea about education. Instead, they're just going to say like the federal government needs to take the lead. And it's going to be assumed by most of your authors that that means the entirety of the federal government. Like the bill will pass through legislation. It will not be vetoed by the president, and the Supreme Court, if it ever goes to trial, will uphold that it is a reasonable plan. The second thing that you need to have after your agent is the action that you're going to do. What are you advocating? Should the United States federal government increase funding for STEM education? Should they build new schools? Should they build new roads? Should they start hacking countries that hack small businesses in the United States? What should they do? My suggestion with your action is that it should be specific to what the literature talks about. We'll talk in one of the later videos that I'll have a link to at the end of this about how to do that when you're trying to figure out what case or what plan you want to read. But normally what you want to do is find a scholar, find an author who says we should do something, and then advocate to do that. Like say, this is what we should do. Because the scholar that you're reading from has done the research, which means that honestly, most of the time, you're going to have a lot better success arguing that in front of most judges because they'll have researched it. The third and fourth and fifth parts of the plan text aren't always necessarily in the plan. You won't necessarily always write these down, but you should at the very least know what these things are. The next piece is what is called enforcement. How are we going to make sure the plan is carried out? For example, if the topic was about increasing alternative energy incentives, the federal government might pass a law to give a permanent tax credit to companies that develop wind farms. However, whether or not the individual wind farms actually use it toward developing wind or if they just pocket it, might be something that needs to be enforced. On this most recent high school topic, there were lots of questions having to do with how immigration regulations got enforced. And so it's just one of those things that if you're going to have a specific enforcement mechanism, you probably at least should think about how your plan would be enforced to make sure that private citizens follow through if they need to. The fourth part is the funding mechanism for the plan. Most of the time, most debaters just assume that this will be done through kind of the general federal revenue, that the federal government, if they need to increase taxes for it, will, or if they need to trade off programs, they will. Realistically, most of the time, you'll either just say it's guaranteed or that it's through normal means when it comes to funding. Occasionally, teams will try to be tricky here and say things like, funding for the affirmative plan will come through a tax on toilet paper or cigarettes or whatever. I would just caution you against that, because if you put a specific type of funding mechanism in, there's a pretty good chance that that funding mechanism could do something better than the affirmative plan. Case in point, if your affirmative plan is to provide school uniforms because they reduce violence in schools, that's probably a good thing. And if you were to say, like, in order to fund all of the school uniforms, we're going to put a 2% tax on cigarettes, that's also probably not a bad thing. And honestly, in the real world is probably how things would work. But a negative might try to be smart about this and say, okay, we'll put the exact same 2% tax on cigarettes, but instead we'll use that to feed hungry children around the world, or we will use that to prevent victims of terrorism from having PTSD or something of that nature, and say, look, like, the impact to the counterplan is much bigger and the money can't be used for both things, so it'd be better to vote negative. That discussion is in the counterplan section when it comes to funding, but most of the time you'll just want to say it's guaranteed. Yes, that does make you susceptible to arguments like spending disadvantages, but ultimately, strategically, you're probably just better off accepting that as part of the debate. The final part about the plan, and this is, again, most of the time isn't said, but it's just understood, is that the affirmative will have what is called fiat. Now, fiat is a word that means, like, let it be, let it just happen. We'll pretend that this happens. It's kind of like the affirmative magic wand, where you get to say, like, I think this is what should happen, and for the rest of the debate, we will debate whether or not it should or shouldn't. The notion of fiat is also to prevent the negative team from saying, well, like, the current president would veto that, or like so-and-so senator would not vote for that, thus it wouldn't ever happen. Because the debate really isn't, would this happen, but rather, should it happen? And so the notion is that the affirmative gets to pretend that their plan passes. That if there's another law that it's against, that it just overwhelms that law, that this is the thing that is upheld as constitutional, and that it would continue to be held that way for eternity, realistically, through something that's called durable fiat, which just means that the plan will continue to exist forever. Now, those things don't need to be articulated out loud in the plan text, they're mostly just assumed, but you need to be able to talk about them when you're thinking about how your plan actually operates. With that said, when you're developing your plan, make sure you also take advantage of watching the next video on how to pick out your case. And if you have any questions, make sure you send me an email. Subscribe if you'd like. Bye.